from New Hampshire, Senator Gregg, took to the floor yesterday to express his outrage that 10 senators on the Budget Committee voted for an amendment that I offered, which lost, by the way, 12-10, to begin the process of breaking up too big to fail financial institutions that pose a catastrophic risk to our economy. And quite frankly, after listening to Senator Gregg's statement, I wonder with all due sincerity what planet he is living on. Apparently, he has missed the fact that due to the greed, the recklessness, and the illegal behavior of Wall Street, that the American people continue to suffer through the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. The damage done by Wall Street in bringing this economy to a grinding halt is incomprehensible. Millions of people having lost their jobs, their homes, their savings. Young people trying to go out to the job market to begin a career in their lives, unable to do that because of the greed of Wall Street. And the fact that just yesterday we could not get one Republican vote to proceed to begin the debate on how we finally reform Wall Street is beyond my comprehension. This debate needs to be going forward, and we need to pass strong, underline strong legislation that makes sure that what happened a year and a half ago never, ever happens again. And, Mr. President, I also find it interesting that we have some of our conservative Republican senators, like Senator Gregg, who day after day tell us how much they dislike big government, don't like Social Security, don't like Medicare, don't like big government, but apparently they have no problem with huge financial institutions which control a very significant part of our economy. In the last 15 years, the 6 largest banks in this country have more than tripled in size and now have combined assets equal to 63% of the gross domestic product. Let me say that again. Those 6 largest banks in this country now have combined assets equal to 63% of this nation's GDP. So all of my conservative friends that come down, oh, government is too big, government is awful. What about banks that have trillions of dollars in assets? Why aren't we talking about that reality? The truth is that today, what we are seeing with these huge financial institutions is not only the ongoing problem of what happens when they fail and whether the taxpayers will be having to bail them out again, but when you have that kind of concentration of ownership, you have a very, very dangerous situation. Mr. President, the 4 largest banks in this country, 4 banks, issue 2/3 of the credit cards. Now, what do we think about that? Everybody in the world has a credit card. 4 banks issue 2/3 of that. Now, how does that tally with the rhetoric I hear from my conservative friends about a competitive economy? Competition is what drives prices down. Well, maybe one of the reasons that millions of Americans today are paying 25 or 30% interest rates on their credit cards is that you got 4 banks that issue 2/3 of them. Mr. President, the 4 largest banks in this country provide half of the mortgages in America. I think that that is a real problem. The 4 largest banks control nearly 40% of all bank deposits in this country. Now, over 100 years ago, we had some good Republicans, William Howard Taft and Teddy Roosevelt. And what they said when they saw the concentration of ownership and wealth that existed in their time, they, as good Republicans, they said, let's start breaking it up. And I think what they did over 100 years ago is a lesson that we should learn today. If a financial institution is too big to fail, that financial institution is too big to exist, and the time is now to start breaking them up. Mr. President, this idea of starting to break up large financial institutions is not just an idea that Bernie Sanders had. It's not just an idea that an amendment offered by Senators Brown and Kaufman is going to speak to. It's an idea that is spreading all over this country. I would point out to you that the presidents of 3 regional Federal Reserve banks also support the need to start breaking up large financial institutions. And they are James Bullard, who is the president of the Fed in St. Louis, Thomas Honig, the president of the Fed in Kansas City, and Richard Fisher, the president of the Fed in Dallas, Texas. And they are all in general agreement that we have got to start breaking up these large financial institutions. Mr. President, Senator Dorgan made this point, and I want to make it again, and that is that during the bailout, the Fed decided that it was going to lend out trillions of dollars in zero or almost zero interest loans. And when Chairman Bernanke came before the Budget Committee on which I serve, I asked him what I thought was a pretty simple and straightforward question, and that is, Mr. Chairman, can you tell me and the American people who received these loans? I mean, we're talking about trillions of dollars in loans. I don't think it's too much to ask who received the loans, what the terms were of those loans. Well, Mr. Bernanke disagreed, and I offered an amendment that day that begins to bring transparency to the Fed. And that amendment is called the Federal Reserve Sunshine Act. And I am happy to say, Mr. President, that it has 32 co-sponsors. Interestingly enough, 22 of them are Republicans, 10 are Democrats. And they are Senator Barrasso, Bennett of Utah, Boxer, Brownback, Burr, Cardin, Chambliss, Coburn, Cochran, Cornyn, Crapo, DeMint, Dorgan, Feingold, Graham, Grassley, Harkin, Hatch, Hutchinson, Inhofe, Isaacson, Landrieu, Leahy, Lincoln, McCain, Murkowski, Risch, Thune, Vitta, Webb, Wicker, and Wyden. That is quite a cross-section of political views in favor of bringing transparency to the Fed. And, Mr. President, what my amendment will do, and we intend to bring that amendment to the floor during this debate, is in fact would require the Federal Reserve to release all of the details about the more than $2 trillion in zero-interest loans that the Fed provided to large financial institutions. And also, it would call for a GAO audit of the Fed. And the bottom line there, Mr. President, is that it is imperative that the GAO conduct an independent and comprehensive audit of the Federal Reserve within 1 year, and that's what our amendment does. It requires the Federal Reserve to disclose the names of the financial institutions that received over $2 trillion in virtually zero interest loans since the start of the recession. And, Mr. President, this is an amendment that I think millions of people want. And what's interesting about it is you talk about bipartisanship or tripartisanship. This amendment, both in the House and the Senate, brings together some of the more conservative members and some of the more progressive members. In the House, this language is supported by my former colleague Ron Paul, and I'm introducing it here in the Senate. And that, my friends, is a very significant disparity in political views. But we do agree that the Fed needs transparency. So, Mr. President, let me conclude by simply saying this. The time is now for the United States Senate to begin to deal with the greed, the recklessness, and the illegal behavior on Wall Street. The American people have demanded action since this crisis began, and we owe it to them to deliver. And as we proceed with Senator Dodd's piece of legislation, which I think has many, many very positive attributes, I think our goal as the debate continues is to make it even stronger. And in that regard, as I've just mentioned, I will be bringing forth an amendment dealing with Fed transparency. I will be bringing forth an amendment which will put a cap on the interest rates that banks can charge. I think it is not acceptable, not moral, that banks are now charging 25, 30% interest rates. We're going to have a cap similar to what exists for credit unions. And as I mentioned also, we're going to have legislation and amendment dealing with Fed transparency. So, Mr. President, my hope is that our Republican friends will join us in beginning this debate and, in fact, going forward so that finally, we can hold Wall Street accountable and bring forth the legislation to make sure that never again do we see a repetition of the disaster that we saw a year and a half ago. With that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kansas.
Mr. President, I understand I have 10 minutes in which to make my